The Inheritance of Ash, a US noir saga complete manuscript. Setting: the Sterling Peninsula sat like a polished tooth at the edge of the Pacific, an obscene geometry of glass and steel cantilevered over basalt and wind. Locals called it the sarcophagus, $50 million of architecture that refused to meet the horizon. Rain ran down its skin in silver veins. The house had a name and a will. The town had a shoreline and a secret. Julian Sterling had been a man who made money by making things disappear. He died with a smile that looked like a ledger entry. His children arrived with their own ledgers, influence, followers, legal teams, and a South Dakota trust that read like a riddle. The estate's fine print had teeth. Moral turpitude could chew heirs out of inheritance. The real teeth, however, were buried in the ground beneath the house. ACT-1, The Gilded Funeral. Rain blurred the world into grayscale. Luxury SUVs hissed through puddles, umbrellas bobbed like small, expensive jellyfish. The wake was a study in wasp coldness, faces carved from restraint, voices measured to the decimal. They were not people so much as entities, representatives of funds, of boards, of market caps that could swallow a town and still have change. Vance Sterling stood at the edge of the room, a camera phone in his palm and a practiced blankness on his face. He was Julian's son by blood and by brand, a fin-tock influencer who could make a stock twitch with a single clip. He watched the mourners perform grief like a quarterly report. At the center of the room, Diana Sterling, Julian's widow, moved with the same surgical grace that had kept the family's public image spotless. Her black dress was a silhouette of control. She smiled at the right moments. She did not cry. Then every phone buzzed. A single text, identical for all, dead man's switch, a link, a live feed. They watched together and alone as the camera panned down into the estate's basement. The feed was grainy, the light a single swinging bulb. For a moment the frame showed only concrete and pipes. Then a silhouette moved, human, deliberate, kneeling by a rusted hatch. Someone was already looking for the truth. The room inhaled, the entities recalculated. VANCE internal monologue, funeral chapter. The room smelled like lilies and ledger paper. It was a smell he could have put on a mood board. Antiseptic white flowers, the faint citrus of expensive hand soap, the metallic tang of the ocean pressed against glass. He had learned to read rooms the way other people read faces, where the light pooled, where the eyes darted, which corners held the quiet money. Today the room read like a balance sheet, assets in the front, liabilities in the back, reputations amortized over polite condolences. He had practiced grief the way he practiced a pitch. There was a cadence to it, pause, softening, the single line that made strangers lean in. He could perform sorrow in 15 seconds and make it look like revelation. He could monetize authenticity. He had built a career on the illusion that honesty and attention were interchangeable currencies. He had not built a career on being honest with himself. Julian's coffin was a dark rectangle under a halo of white. The lilies trembled in the draft from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the ocean was a sheet of pewter, indifferent and patient. He had spent his childhood watching his father measure the world in margins and margins alone. Julian had taught him to value outcomes over feelings, to prefer the clean arithmetic of decisions to the messy calculus of conscience. Love, in that house, had been a conditional distribution. He remembered the first time his father had corrected him in public. Vance had been 12, wearing a tie that was too short, and Julian had straightened it with a hand that smelled faintly of machine oil and cologne. The correction had been a lesson disguised as affection. Presentation matters, Julian had said. People invest in certainty. Vance had learned to present certainty and to hide the tremor beneath. Now the tremor was in his pocket, a phone that could make markets move and perhaps make a town listen. He had followers who trusted him to parse truth from spin. He had a trust that could cut him off for a single misstep. He had a family that could weaponize reputation. He had a basement that might contain a different kind of ledger, one written in chemicals and fissures. When the text came, dead man's switch, he felt the room tilt. The feed was grainy, a single bulb swinging in a concrete belly. For a moment it was only pipes and shadow. Then a silhouette moved, deliberate and small against the scale of the house. Someone was already looking. Someone had already decided that Julian's tidy arithmetic might have a messy remainder. He thought of the moral clause in the trust, the way the family had turned reputation into a legal cudgel. Moral turpitude, a phrase that could be stretched like taffy to fit any inconvenient truth. He thought of the staged affair, the insurance payout, the way scandal had been engineered to harvest a different kind of capital. He thought of the South Dakota Trust that blinked out of reach like a ghost in a jurisdictional fog. He felt the old ache of being the son of a man who measured affection in returns. He felt the new ache of being the son of a man who might have poisoned a town to save a line item. The two aches did not cancel each other, they compounded. He watched the mourners perform grief with the same clinical eye he used on markets. There were the institutional faces, board members, fund managers, who nodded in calibrated sympathy. There were the lawyers who watched for slips. There were the PR people who catalogued every expression for future use. They were not people so much as entities, avatars of capital, trained to preserve value. He thought of the fishermen who had taught him to bait a hook, of the diner where his mother had taken him for pancakes before she left, of the wells that tasted faintly of metal in summer. He had not been back in years. The house had been a fortress and a showroom. The town had been a backdrop, a place to be managed. He had always believed transparency was a kind of power. He had used his followers as leverage, as social capital convertible into legal capital if needed. But influence was brittle. It could be amplified and it could be cut off. The trust could interpret moral turpitude to mean anything. The law could be patient. The ocean could be indifferent. The silhouette in the feed bent to a hatch. The room inhaled. The entities recalculated. Vance felt the phone like a compass, a tool that could point him toward either preservation or exposure. He had choices, always had, but they had been framed by his father's rules. Today the rules were different. The ledger beneath the house might be written in a language that could not be reconciled with the family's balance sheet. He put the phone in his pocket and walked to the glass. The ocean was a cold, honest thing. It did not care about trusts or clauses. It only moved. He felt, for the first time in a long time, the possibility that telling the truth might cost him everything he had been taught to value. He also felt the possibility that keeping the ledger secret would cost other people everything they had. He did not know which cost he could live with. ACT2, the forensic audit, the Delaware loophole. Vance left the wake with the taste of salt and old money in his mouth. He went to his studio in the house's glass wing and set up a ring light. The camera loved him. The camera made him honest in ways his family never had. He pulled up the feed, then the filings. He had learned to read corporate DNA the way others read faces. The Series LLC in South Dakota was a neat, legal hydra. Sub-entities, nominee managers, a trust that blinked out of reach. The money wasn't missing. It had been desitused, legally domiciled where creditors and tax collectors could not touch it. It existed like a ghost in a jurisdictional fog. He called a friend, an old forensic accountant who smelled of coffee and late nights. Their conversation was procedural, clinical, a map of loopholes and legal architecture. Vance listened, recording the explanation for his followers, because transparency was currency and currency was influence. Forensic dialogue, Vance and Eli extended. Eli, start with the entity structure. Think of it like a tree. At the top you have the trust, South Dakota Silent Trust. Under that a holding LLC. Under that a series LLC. Each series is treated as a separate cell. Vance, separate cell how? Like separate bank accounts. Eli, legally separate liabilities and assets. Delaware's Series LLC statute allows a single LLC to create internal series, each with its own members, managers, assets and liabilities. If properly structured, creditors of one series cannot reach assets of another. It's a firewall on paper. Vance, so the money can be parked in a series and be invisible. Eli, invisible to a degree. If the series is managed by nominee managers and the beneficial ownership is held by a trust in South Dakota, you add layers. South Dakota has favorable trust laws, decanting powers, directed trusts, and privacy protections. Combine that with nominee directors in Delaware, and you have a structure that's opaque to outside scrutiny. Vance, nominee directors, people who exist on paper but don't actually run anything. Eli, exactly. They're often professional service firms or individuals who sign documents. The beneficial owner is the trust. The trust's trustee can be a corporate trustee in South Dakota, which answers to state law that favors settlors and protects privacy. If the trust is silent, it doesn't have to notify beneficiaries in the way other jurisdictions might. Vance, what about the moral turpitude clause? How does that interact? Eli, that's a conditional distribution clause. The trust can specify that beneficiaries forfeit distributions if they engage in conduct defined as moral turpitude. It's a blunt instrument. It gives the trustee discretion to withhold funds. If the trustee is aligned with the family's corporate counsel, they can interpret the clause broadly. Vance, so they can cut me off for posting something they don't like. Eli, they can, but there are checks. Beneficiaries can sue for breach of fiduciary duty. The problem is jurisdictional friction. If the trust is in South Dakota and the trust instruments are drafted to limit judicial review, litigation becomes expensive and slow. Meanwhile, the assets remain insulated. Vance, what about taxes? If the money is in a South Dakota trust, does the IRS see it? Eli, the IRS sees what's reported. If the trust is structured as a grantor trust for tax purposes, the grantor pays taxes. If it's an intentionally defective grantor trust or a non-grantor trust, reporting differs. The key is situs. If the trust is administered in South Dakota and the trustee is a South Dakota entity, the state law governs many aspects. The IRS can audit, but enforcement across state lines and through nominee structures is complex. Vance and the Series LLC. Eli, Delaware Series LLC doesn't require public filing of each series assets. The master LLC files, but the internal series can be kept off public record. If the operating agreements are private and the nominee managers are the public face, tracing beneficial ownership requires subpoenas, discovery, and often cooperation from foreign or out-of-state entities. Vance, so the money is not gone, it's just parked behind a legal firewall. Eli, precisely. And if you layer in offshore entities, you add another jurisdictional moat. But even without offshore, the combination of Delaware Series, South Dakota trust law, nominee managers, and careful contract drafting creates a practical invisibility. Vance, how do you pierce that veil? Eli, you need leverage. Discovery and litigation is one route. Regulatory action is another. If you can show environmental contamination tied to the estate, you can trigger government enforcement, EPA, state environmental agencies. Those agencies have subpoena power and can force production. A Superfund designation creates a legal pathway to remediation costs and liens. Vance, so the environmental angle is the key. Eli, often it is. Money hides behind corporate law. Contamination creates statutory obligations that can reach through the corporate veil. The EPA can issue orders, seek cost recovery, and place liens. Once remediation is required, the economic calculus changes. Trustees and beneficiaries suddenly have to account for liabilities that dwarf the trust's distributions. Vance, but the trust is silent. The trustee can refuse to act. Eli, trustees have fiduciary duties. If they fail to act in the face of legal obligations, beneficiaries or regulators can sue. The problem is time and money. Litigation is slow. Meanwhile, the contamination continues. That's why public exposure matters. If you can create reputational pressure, you can force actors to move faster. Vance, so my followers matter. Eli, they do. Influence can be leverage. It's not a legal remedy, but it changes incentives. Boards and trustees respond to reputational risk. If the story goes public and investors or clients react, the trustees may be forced to act to preserve value. Vance, how do we prove the link between the estate and the contamination? Eli, paper trail and physical evidence. Invoices, disposal contracts, maintenance logs, and environmental sampling. If you can show that waste streams from Julian's aerospace operations were routed to the estate's disposal system, and if you can show elevated levels of PFAS and other contaminants in groundwater and leachate, you have a chain. Combine that with expert testimony and you have a case. Vance and the Series LLC. Eli, you subpoena the operating agreements, the bank records, the nominee agreements. You use discovery to force production. If the trustee resists, you use regulatory leverage. If the trustee is a corporate trustee with fiduciary obligations, they can be compelled to cooperate. Vance, it sounds like a war of attrition. Eli, it is, but wars of attrition can be won with the right pressure points. Public exposure, regulatory action, and targeted litigation can break the structure. The question is whether you want to spend the capital, time, reputation, money to do it. Vance, or whether I want to keep the money and let the town keep drinking. Eli, that's the moral calculus. The law gives you options, the choice is yours. Eli, one more practical note. When you subpoena, you look for anomalies, payments to shell companies, repeated small transfers that aggregate into large sums, invoices with vague descriptions, and recurring payments to entities with no employees. You look for nominee signatures that don't match operational records. You look for insurance claims tied to staged events. You look for internal memos that rationalize cost avoidance. Those are the fingerprints. Vance, so the ledger is the confession if you know how to read it. Eli, ledgers lie less than people. They tell a story if you know the language. ACT 3, the easement wore the environmental noir. The house was a fortress with no road. 50 feet of gravel, owned by Silas Miller, a farmer whose hands had the honest calluses of someone who worked with soil rather than spreadsheets, blocked the only practical access. Sterling's lawyers had offered money. Silas had refused. Money could not buy the memory of a poisoned well. Silas's sister, Maggie, had been the town's quiet conscience. She had come to the sarcophagus as an environmental investigator under a different name, a whistleblower with a badge and a heart that had softened in the presence of the man she was supposed to expose. She had fallen for Julian in the way people fall for danger, slowly, then all at once. Silas showed Vance the leachate, oily sheens in puddles, a film that did not wash away. He spoke of wells that tasted of metal, of cows that carved stillborn, of children with rashes that would not quit. He told the story of Julian's aerospace firm and the disposal fees that had been too high for a man who measured everything in margins. Julian had chosen the cheapest route, bury it in the basalt, let the ocean and the town take the rest. Vance walked the land with Silas, boots sinking into gravel, the wind carrying the smell of salt and something chemical and wrong. The house above them gleamed like a promise. Below, the ground had been bought and sold in silence. Silas's refusal to sell was not stubbornness, it was memory. He remembered the day his father came home with a check and a smile and a promise that the new plant would bring jobs. He remembered the first time the well tasted off. He remembered the first calf that did not stand. He remembered the meetings where Julian's men had smiled and said the tests were inconclusive. He had watched the town get smaller in ways that did not show up on any balance sheet. Maggie had been the one to dig deeper. She had taken samples, run tests, and found the fingerprints of modern industry, PFAS, solvents, compounds that did not belong in a fishing town. She had tried to bring the evidence to regulators and been met with delays and polite refusals. She had fallen in love with Julian in the middle of that fight, a dangerous intimacy that blurred the lines between whistleblower and witness. When Vance met her, she was tired but steady. She had a file in her hand and a look that said she had already decided what she would do if the law failed. She had copies of lab reports, chain of custody forms, and a map of the estate's subsurface plumbing. She had traced pipes from the house's basement to injection points in the basalt. She had traced invoices to shell companies. She had traced signatures to Julian's hand. Vance felt the weight of the evidence like a physical thing. He had always thought of his father as a strategist. Now he saw him as a man who had chosen expedience over people. He felt the old ache of being the son of a man who had taught him to hide. He felt the new ache of being the son of a man who had made a town sick. ACT 4, the basement discovery, the sarcophagus. Descending into sub-level 0 was like stepping through a membrane. Above, glass curated art, the hum of climate control. Below, concrete pipes, the smell of ozone and PFAS, those forever chemicals that did not know how to die. The light changed from warm to clinical. The air tasted of metal and old batteries. The hatch was heavy and rusted at the edges. When Vance pushed it open, the smell hit him first, a metallic tang undercut by something sweet and chemical, like burnt plastic and old pennies. His phone light cut a narrow cone through the dark. The basement was a cathedral of engineering gone rogue. Stainless steel tanks with faded hazard placards, corroded valves, a maze of piping that led into the basalt itself. The tanks were labelled in a hand that had once been neat. Waste stream A, waste stream B, neutralization batch. The labels had been partially scrubbed, but the ghost of ink remained. There were gauges with needles stuck at odd angles, pressure relief valves that had been welded shut, and a bank of pumps that hummed faintly as if remembering their purpose. The piping was a map. It ran from the tanks to a series of injection manifolds embedded in the basalt. The manifolds were concrete-encased ports where waste had been forced into fissures in the rock. There were hairline cracks in the basalt where the concrete had failed, and from those cracks, the rock wept a dark, oily fluid that pooled in the floor drains and ran into the perimeter sump. Vance crouched and scooped a sample into a plastic vial Maggie handed him. The liquid clung to his fingers and left a faint sheen. He could taste the memory of it on his tongue when he licked his lips. Metallic, bitter, wrong. He thought of the children's clinic and the filters that did not always work. He thought of the cows and the wells and the fishermen who had noticed fewer fish in the nets. The engineering of the disposal system was both crude and cunning. Julian's firm had installed a series of holding tanks and a high-pressure injection system that forced liquid waste into the basalt's fracture network. The basalt, a dense volcanic rock, seemed an unlikely place to hide fluid, but its natural fissures and joints provided pathways. The injection points had been chosen where the rock's permeability was highest, where the fissures connected to groundwater channels that fed the town's wells. The system had been designed to avoid detection. There were bypass valves that could route flows to temporary holding tanks during inspections. There were sacrificial filters that could be swapped out and destroyed. There were invoices for neutralization services that paid for chemical treatments that masked the signature of the waste. There were shell companies that billed for disposal and then disappeared. He found maintenance logs in a locked cabinet. The logs had been redacted in places, but the pattern was clear. There were entries for scheduled disposal, followed by payments to companies with PO boxes. There were entries for emergency injection during inspections. There were entries where the words had been scratched out and replaced with initials. He found a ledger entry, Julian's handwriting, an admission disguised as a line item, cost avoidance. 2.3M, the number was small compared to the estate's net worth, but it was the kind of arithmetic that explained choices. It was the kind of arithmetic that had turned a town's water into a ledger problem. The injection manifolds were corroded and stained. The fissures in the basalt had mineral precipitates that indicated long-term fluid flow. The groundwater monitoring wells around the property showed elevated levels of PFAS and solvents. The isotopic signatures matched the formulations used by Julian's firm. Diana met him at the hatch with a folder and a smile that had been practiced in boardrooms. She offered him a deal: sign the papers, keep the South Dakota money, and let the town keep drinking. Or expose the truth, trigger the EPA's Superfund process, and watch the estate be seized, the trust collapse, and the family's fortune evaporate into remediation costs and legal fees. She framed it as a choice between two kinds of legacy. She did not ask him to forgive Julian. She asked him to decide what kind of sterling he would be. Vance thought of his followers, of the thousands who watched him parse markets and morals. He thought of Maggie's face when she showed him the children's clinic with its water filters and its empty waiting room. He thought of Sealers, who had refused money because some things were not for sale. He thought of the smell of the basement and the way the rock wept. He thought of the ledger entry and the neatness of Julian's handwriting. He thought of the way the house above had been built to look like a promise, while the ground below had been used as a ledger for disposal. He thought of choices: technical deep dive, engineering, chemistry and remediation, site description and subsurface architecture. The Sterling estate sits on a basalt outcrop overlain by a thin veneer of glacial, till and coastal sediments. Basalt, while dense, is not monolithic. It fractures along joints and cooling columns, creating a network of interconnected fissures. Julian's engineers exploited these natural pathways. The basement's injection manifolds were set into concrete pads keyed into the basalt, with steel casings penetrating the rock to reach fracture zones identified in early geotechnical surveys. Injection system design: holding tanks, a bank of stainless steel tanks, 10, 00050 000 litres each, with secondary containment. Tanks were labelled waste stream AB and neutralization batch. Corrosion patterns indicated long-term exposure to acidic and surfactant-laden fluids. Pumps and pressure systems: high-pressure positive displacement pumps capable of injecting fluids at pressures exceeding 1,500 psi, sufficient to force fluids into microfractures and propagate fluid pathways. Manifolds and ports: concrete-encased injection ports with steel manifolds distributing flow to multiple boreholes. Valves and check systems allowed selective routing. Bypass lines permitted temporary diversion during inspections. Monitoring infrastructure: sparse. A handful of monitoring wells existed but were poorly sited, down gradient from the injection points but not in the primary flow paths. Data logs showed intermittent sampling and gaps coinciding with maintenance entries. Chemical signature and laboratory findings: PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, detected at concentrations orders of magnitude above EPA health advisory levels in both leachate and private wells. PFAS compounds identified included PFOA, PFOS, and several short-chain analogues consistent with aerospace surfactant formulations. Chlorinated solvents: TCE and PCE present in groundwater and in the basement sump. Their presence indicates degreasing and solvent-based cleaning operations, typical of precision aerospace manufacturing. Complex organics. GCMS profiles revealed polymeric breakdown products and fluorinated organics, consistent with composite processing and specialty coatings. Trace metals. Elevated levels of chromium and nickel in sediment samples near injection manifolds, suggesting electroplating or specialty alloy processing. Isotopic and fingerprint analysis. Isotopic ratios. Carbon and chlorine isotopic signatures of solvents matched formulations used by Julian's aerospace firm, as confirmed by comparative analysis of on-site stock chemical samples and vendor MSDS. Compound-specific fingerprinting. The PFAS homologue distribution and presence of proprietary fluorinated surfactants provided a chemical fingerprint linking the waste to processes documented in Julian's plant procurement records. Hydrogeologic pathways. Fracture connectivity. Dye tracer tests, conducted by Maggie's team, showed rapid connectivity between injection points and shallow groundwater within weeks, faster than diffusion through matrix porosity would allow. This indicated preferential flow through fractures. Tidal influence. The coastal setting introduced tidal pumping effects. Seawater intrusion and tidal fluctuations altered hydraulic gradients, mobilizing contaminants toward nearshore wells and estuarine sediments. Seasonal variability. Winter recharge events increased hydraulic head, pushing contaminants further into the aquifer system. Summer low-flow conditions concentrated contaminants in private wells. Remediation options and cost modeling. 1. Containment and source removal. Immediate actions. Decommission injection system. Remove tanks and secure the basement to prevent further discharge. Estimated emergency removal, $500K 2M. Source excavation. Excavate contaminated concrete pads and injection manifolds. Remove and treat contaminated soils and concrete. Complexity due to basalt anchoring increases cost. Estimated $2M 6M. 2. Pump and treat systems. Design. Install extraction wells down gradient. Treat via activated carbon and high-pressure membrane systems for PFAS, and advanced oxidation for organics. Operational costs. High for PFAS. Granular activated carbon GAC requires frequent replacement. Ion exchange resins and high-pressure reverse osmosis are expensive. Annual O&M, $500K 2M depending on scale. 3. In situ stabilization and immobilization. Permeable reactive barriers, PRBs. Install PRBs with activated carbon or zero-valent ion to intercept plumes. Effective for certain organics and metals. PFAS are less amenable. In situ chemical oxidation, ISCO. Use oxidants to degrade chlorinated solvents, limited efficacy on PFAS. 4. Thermal treatment. Ex situ thermal desorption. For soils with high PFAS concentrations, thermal desorption followed by off-site destruction can be effective but costly. Unit costs can exceed $1,000 to $500 per ton depending on concentration. 5. Long-term monitoring and health measures. Point-of-use point-of-entry filters, immediate relief for affected households, installation of certified PFAS removal systems. Cost per household, $2K 10K plus maintenance. Medical monitoring programs, epidemiological studies and health screenings funded by responsible parties. Initial program costs, $250K 1M. Preliminary remediation cost estimate, ballpark. Emergency containment and initial investigation, $1M 3M. Source removal and excavation, $2M 8M. Treatment systems and long-term O&M, 10 years, $10M 40M. Community health and monitoring, $1M 5M. Total preliminary estimate, $14M 56M, highly dependent on plume extent, PFAS concentrations and regulatory requirements. Forensic engineering notes. Evidence of intent. The presence of bypass valves, sacrificial filters and redacted maintenance logs suggests deliberate measures to evade detection. Correlate maintenance entries with inspection dates and third-party sampling events. Operational records. Cross-reference procurement records for injection equipment, vendor invoices for neutralization chemicals, and shipping manifests for waste shipments. Look for patterns of off-site disposal claims that do not match on-site injection volumes. Expert testimony. Hydrogeologists and remediation engineers can model contaminant transport and estimate time of arrival at private wells, supporting claims of exposure and causation. Flashbacks, the gentleman's agreement, and other VIGNETTS. The past was a ledger too, written in decisions and compromises. These flashbacks show how the bargain was made and how it rippled outward. Flashback 1, the offer, Tom Miller, 1994. The diner was half empty and smelled of coffee and grease. Julian wore a suit that looked like it had been tailored by a man who measured people in margins. Tom Miller had hands that told a different story, calloused, stained, honest. Julian slid a check across the formica as if it were a business card. "We'll bring jobs," he said. "We'll build a plant. You'll have steady work." Tom turned the check over in his fingers. He had a mortgage and a boy who wanted to be a mechanic. The town had been losing its young people to cities. A plant meant paychecks, school sports, a roof that did not leak. "What's the catch?" he asked. Julian smiled the way men who sell futures smile. "No catch, just trust me." The words were soft, practiced. Tom thought of his son's future and folded the check into his wallet. He thought he had done the right thing. Flashback 2, the first taste, Tom's wife, late 1990s. The water tasted like pennies. Tom's wife called him from the kitchen, voice small. "It smells funny," she said. He went to the well and cupped the water in his hands. It had a metallic tang that made his teeth ache. He called the plant manager. The manager came, took a sample, and said the tests were inconclusive. "We'll monitor it," he said. Tom watched the trucks leave the plant at night and wondered what they carried. He told himself the tests would clear. He told himself he had done the right thing. The check in his wallet felt heavier. Flashback 3, the walk on the bluff, Julian and Tom, 1996. They walked the bluff with the ocean breathing below. Julian spoke of efficiency and margins of the cost of proper disposal. "You don't understand," he said. "Disposal costs are killing small manufacturers. If we can find a cheaper route, we can keep the plant open and the jobs here." Tom listened. He thought of his son's future, of the smell in the well, of the check. He made a choice that night, to accept a compromise that would buy time and jobs at the cost of a future he could not yet see. They shook hands like men who had made a pact. Flashback 4, Maggie's first report, Maggie, early 2000s. Maggie had been young and idealistic when she first tested the water. She had a badge and a clipboard and a stubbornness that made her ask the wrong questions. Her lab results came back with numbers that made her stomach drop. PFAS, solvents, compounds that did not belong in a fishing town. She took the report to Julian. He smiled and offered her a job in the plant's community outreach. She refused. He offered her a donation to the clinic. She refused. He offered her a quiet conversation. She accepted, and in the quiet she found a man who could be charming and cruel in the same breath. She fell for him in the middle of the fight, a dangerous intimacy that blurred the lines between witness and witness protector. Flashback 5, Diana's Ascent, Boardroom, 2008. Diana learned to move in rooms where decisions were made in margins and footnotes. She had a talent for reading legal language and for translating it into strategy. When Julian's health began to fail, she stepped into the firm's operational center and learned to steer the machine. She learned how to draft clauses that protected assets and how to craft narratives that preserved reputation. She did not love Julian the way Maggie had. She loved the architecture of power. She learned to see the trust as a tool and the town as a variable. She learned to count the cost of choices and to prefer options that preserved capital. She learned to smile at funerals. Flashback 6, Tom's reckoning, later years. At a funeral years after the first check, Tom stood in the rain and watched the sarcophagus glint on the bluff. He thought of the children who had been born with rashes, of the fishermen who had fewer fish in their nets, of the nights he had sat with his wife and listened to the hum of the plant. He thought of the ledger and the way it had been written in choices. He felt the weight of the check in his pocket like a stone. He had kept the money. He had kept the silence. He had kept the bargain. Now the bargain had a cost he could not measure. The final choice, Noir ending. Vance realized his only weapon was the thing he had been taught to wield, influence. He set his phone on a rock, framed the leaking fissure, and began to speak. He told the story in the language his audience understood, short takes, raw footage, a voice that trembled with anger and something like grief. He narrated the ledger entries, the series LLC, the leachate, the staged affair. He showed the fissures, the tanks, the invoices. He named names. He hit upload. The progress bar crawled, 12:37:58. He watched the numbers like a man watching a heart monitor. At 99%, the house's smart grid hiccuped. The Wi-Fi blinked out. The feed froze. Diana stood in the doorway, a cell jammer in her hand like a talisman. Her face was a map of decisions. She stepped into the light and whispered, "In this family, Vance, we don't post the truth, we sell it." The screen went black. Aftermath and echoes. The wake had been a performance. The trust was a machine. The house was a tomb and a showroom. The town had been poisoned by convenience and corporate arithmetic. Vance had tried to turn the ledger into a confession and found the ledger had already been written in a language that protected itself. No one left the sarcophagus unmarked. Maggie returned to the town with a file copied in secret. Sealers kept his gravel and his silence, but his eyes were different, less resigned, more ready. Diana closed ranks and opened new ledgers. The South Dakota Trust hummed on, a legal ghost. Vance's upload had been interrupted, but the seed had been planted. A clip leaked, an out-of-focus frame of a fissure, a voice breaking on the word leachate. It spread like a rumor. The town began to ask questions. The EPA sent a letter. Lawyers smelled blood. The family's entities convened. The Superfund process would not be quick. It would be bureaucratic, litigious, and expensive. It would take years to untangle the legal structures and to force remediation. The town would get help in fits and starts. The Sterlings would pay in ways that could not be measured only in dollars. Vance lost access to the trust for a time. He gained something else, a story that would not die. He had traded a ledger for a conscience and found the trade ambiguous. He had learned that influence could be a weapon and a wound. The last image is of the sarcophagus at dawn, rain still on its skin, the ocean indifferent. A gull wheeled and cried. The house looked like a promise and a threat at once. Inside, the family counted their losses and their options. Outside, the town counted its wells. The ledger remained open.